Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. So, we're going to continue our discussion about the human impacts on our environment by talking a little bit about some basics about pollution today. So, when we talk about pollution, pollution is any undesirable factor either added to the air, added to the water, or added to the soil. And we could really dive into the nitty gritty details about pollution and its effects and where it comes from. But I'm just going to give you an overview today. So, one of the things that we can talk about in terms of pollution is maybe one of the things that comes to mind first for most kids, and that is smog. And smog is a type of air pollution. And this is a result of basically little bits of particulate matter that comes from the burning of fossil fuels or burning any sort of component, whether it's coming from our combustion engines, it's coming from factories, it's coming from even burning wood. And those little bits of really tiny particles that you might not be able to see on most days will get trapped up in the atmosphere. Um, and especially on sort of warmer, really sunny days, that's sunlight comes in and interacts with those really tiny little pollution particles in the air and causes this sort of hazing effect. And this is an image of what that smog might look like in a big city, is where we see this most often, because you just think about the collection of all of that particulate matter that's getting created, especially from cars and buses and things like that. And it just forms this haze over the city. Los Angeles is probably one of the most infamous cities for their sort of smog cover, that has been sort of associated with all of the cars and traffic that Los Angeles might be known for. I will say, in the event, or because of the development of hybrid and electric vehicles and people using more mass transit, at least historically, um, their levels have gotten better, but it's not perfect. So what happens is that air pollution, those particles sit in the atmosphere, sun comes in, sort of radiates off of them and almost makes this big, like, grayish, brownish pollution cloud that you can actually see. It's not that the pollution isn't there all the time, it's just having the right set of dynamics in terms of low-lying air, humidity, and then the sunlight interacting with it that you can actually see it. Um, I had the opportunity to go to Cairo when I was in college, and this city is big like Los Angeles. Lots of people have cars. Um, and most of the population of the country lives and works in Cairo. And we were able to go visit this mosque, which sort of sat really high up on a big hill in the middle of the city. And you could just look out and you could see this dark brown sort of haze hanging over it. We were high enough to be able to kind of see over top of it. And it's from all of that burning of fossil fuels and other materials in a really unclean way that allows all of that material to just get into the atmosphere. There's a reason our cars go through emissions inspections, and one of them is to ensure that we aren't pushing more material into the atmosphere than is really necessary, um, when we're driving ourselves from one place to the next. And the results of that smog have some serious health implications, especially for people with asthma and allergies and respiratory issues. This makes it much more difficult for them to be able to breathe, and worsens and exacerbates the symptoms of their condition. Other components to putting all of that particulate matter into the atmosphere is acid rain. And so some of those materials can contain compounds that then, when mixed with gases and water in the atmosphere, can create things like sulfuric acid and nitric acid. They're caused by fossil fuel emissions, whether they're coming from our vehicles or coming from factories, and they end up producing these pollutants in our water cycle that overall cause the pH of the rain to drop. So normal rainfall, we typically expect to see somewhere around a pH of 5.6. Acid rain is usually on a level of 4.6 or lower. Now go back and remember your pH scale. Every time we drop a full number on the pH scale, we're talking 10 times the amount of change in the hydrogen concentration. So when we talk about going from normal rainfall at 5.6 to acidic rainfall at 4.6, we're talking about a tenfold times difference. It's 10 times more acidic. Process that for a second. 10 times more acidic. And the thing is that if you remember about the way that molecules in our body work, we don't do very well as living things to having our pH adjusted by 10 times the acidity, right? We are evolutionarily designed to work within relatively tight ranges. Things like our proteins, our enzymes, our nucleic acids, all of this stuff that requires the hydrogen bonding to happen appropriately so that we fold up in the correct configurations to do the jobs of those molecules. If we start messing with the acidity of that environment, we start messing with the ability for those things to fold properly. We start messing with those foldings. We talk about things like denaturing these molecules. We denature those molecules, they can't do their job. And if they don't do their job, the living things don't survive. The other interesting thing, or the hard thing about sort of convincing people that this was a problem, is that it generally doesn't produce the acid rain right on top of where the emissions are being produced. Instead, they are being produced downstream. So when we talk about big factories in places like Chicago and Detroit, and that sort of thing, they're certainly getting some of the impact there from downwind, but it is causing problems all the way across the eastern seaboard as a result. Um, and so we get this rain and it ends up in our water cycle and it's killing fish and aquatic organisms, which are in very delicate ecosystems and food webs within our aquatic ecosystems. They're having impacts on the trees, which then has impacts on primary productivity and the entire food chain that depends on that. Not only that, this is also having impacts economically for us in terms of adjusting the pHs to environments where we are getting our resources from trees, fish, food sources, crop land, the whole 9 yards. So there were economic, or I should say environmental regulations put in place to help to decrease the acid production. For example, some of those regulations we saw data from sulfur dioxide emissions decreasing somewhere around 31%. When some of these initial regulations went into place late 80s, early 90s, we saw that 31% decrease from 1993 to 2002. Um, and we continue to adjust those regulations for better or worse, and they're going to have impacts on how that acid rain gets produced and the impacts that it has upstream from where that pollution is being pumped into the atmosphere. Another major disturbance or major pollution that was pumped into our atmosphere had major effects on our ozone layer. So when we talk about these molecules called chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, these were very common as coolant molecules in things like refrigerators and air conditioners and things like that. Um, they were produced by human activity, and what would happen is they'd get released into the atmosphere, and what they would do is that they would end up interacting with the oxygen that existed as well as the ozone that exists. And take this a step back for a second. Our atmosphere is surrounded by this ozone layer, this O3 molecules, and that ozone protects us. It prevents excessive amounts of things like UV radiation from coming through our atmosphere and knocking into our molecules. Take this one step even further back and connect this all the way back to our discussion in evolution about that oxygen revolution. Once plants started being able to do photosynthesis and pumping this oxygen up into the atmosphere to produce that ozone layer, we finally got an additional level of protection for things like our DNA. UV radiation comes in, hits our DNA, and it breaks it. That's why we talk about things like skin cancer. That's why you're supposed to wear sunscreen. Um, but all the way back on early Earth, that ozone layer didn't exist. So the only level of protection for our organic molecules, for our simple set of instructions in DNA, was the water. But once these photosynthetic organisms came about, started pumping that oxygen into the atmosphere, interacting with the solar radiation to create that ozone layer, that was the only thing that got us out of the oceans as living things and were able to move on land because we now had that ozone protection in the atmosphere. So when we moved on land, we didn't just get irradiated by UV radiation and just get fried as far as our DNA was concerned. So these chlorofluorocarbons, when we started using them, they were particularly popular in the 50s and 60s, 70s, before we started realizing what was happening, is those CFCs ended up in the atmosphere. They interacted with that ozone and broke it off into chloride peroxide and oxygen molecules. That ends up breaking those chlorine molecules that sort of created these dimers, these two molecule things here. That chloride peroxide got hit with sunlight, broke off some more oxygen and more chlorine, and kind of created this vicious cycle of constantly destroying that ozone molecule, that O3 that we really need desperately to keep that oxygen, or excuse me, keep that ozone layer in place. The interesting thing was that we saw some of the major depletion over some very vulnerable ecological locations, Antarctica, Southern Australia, New Zealand, South America in particular. And those ozone layers had decreased anywhere from 2 to 10% at those mid latitudes over the past 20 years, causing DNA damage in plants, poor photoplankton growth, which again, if we're destroying those primary producers, that's having major impacts on the amount of energy available for the rest of the food chain. So that layer had been gradually thinning since the mid 70s. There was finally an international agreement signed in 1987 that resulted in basically saying we are not using CFCs anymore. They are illegal. You cannot use them. You cannot put them in consumer products.
And so if we take a look, we can see what the ozone layer used to look like back in 1979 is where this image was taken. And you can see that it is starting to thin. We want this nice green kind of layers here, darker colors. And you can start to see that these blues are that thinning that was occurring. By the time we get to the mid 2000s, take a look at how much of that green has just completely disappeared. This is over Antarctica. Um, and so huge impacts when we talk about the thinning of that atmosphere over some really vulnerable populations, very vulnerable locations. And we're seeing depletions even up at higher latitudes as well. This just happens to be one of the most stark differences that we could see based on satellite imagery. Good news is, since we have put that international agreement in place, we have slowly been starting to see some rebounding, and this hole is shrinking. But we are not necessarily back to pre CFC levels in terms of that ozone layer, um, even at this point in time. But I think the take home message of the fact that we are seeing some regeneration is a testament to the fact that we as humans have sort of said, nope, we're gonna make some concerted efforts to fix this problem. And good news for us is that it does seem to be reversible, even if that reversal is slow to come.